everyone, welcome to another episode of The Ghost Furnace. This is your friend Bond. I do not have Nick with me this evening. He was unable to make this conversation, but I do have our new friend Taryn with us. How are you doing tonight, Taryn?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
We're excited to talk to you. The reason I kind of wanted to have this conversation, on a few episodes we've talked about spiritualism, and through that process of us talking about it, seeing some folks' responses, and just doing kind of research, I came to the realization, especially after one of your comments, that I didn't realize that spiritualism was a modern thing still, for lack of a better term. In my mind, it had always been almost like a pop culture movement that had these paranormal tie-ins, these kind of like pseudo-religious tie-ins, had a lot of notoriety, mid 1800s through kind of the turn of the century and a little after. But every time I've spoken about it in like the past tense, which is not the case. Kind of the reason I wanted to talk to you this evening is to help further educate myself, but also educate our listeners, because I think for me, that really changes how I want to address the topic of spiritualism, because it is an active thing that people practice and are a part of, and there's communities around it and belief systems, and it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more there's a lot more to it than what I initially realized. And you yourself are a practitioner, is that correct?
Yes, I'm a spiritualist.
And whenever I learned that, I was like, oh, this is someone who I could actually talk to and get some firsthand information, because as I'm sure you know, looking things up online is not always the best way to get a philosophy across or get practices across, kind of thing. So I was really hoping we could have this conversation, and I'm sure I'm going to learn things still. So just to kind of like start us out and everything, how would you define spiritualism as a religion, as a movement, as a philosophy maybe? How would you define it, and what is it?
I guess I would define spiritualism as a religion that is more community-based. We're not worshiping anyone. We don't worship the Fox sisters. It's generally not like a Christian-leaning religion. So I kind of feel like spiritualism in general is a religion based on the belief that we can communicate with people after they pass.
So like the core, because I think in a lot of religions, there's some kind of knowledge being passed, whether it's divine, or whether it's coming from within, or whether it's coming from universal truths, But so in spiritualism, the passage of knowledge comes from speaking with. Now, do you guys refer to them as the dead or spirits, or
spirits or spirit in general? For getting like a message from spirit, usually we'll just say spirit, unless you can say who the message is from. But spiritualists in general, we believe in communicating with people after they pass, that there truly is no death. We can still communicate with people after they've passed. And we're big proponents of, like afterlife, in general, that there is life after death. And, the messages that we get from people who have passed, that is proof that, there is an afterlife, people are okay. And that's kind of a way that we communicate with them.
So how is there a definition, or is there how do you separate the idea of spiritualism as like the belief structure that you kind of just outlined, versus like we talk about mediumship a lot, and the idea of people who are mediums in the paranormal community, is that kind of one and the same, or is there a distinction there that people should be drawing between the two?
Well, you can be a medium and not be a spiritualist. And people can be spiritualists and not be mediums. I mean, we've had people come to our church. They say they are not mediums. They say they are not sensitive. They say they do not have any type of spirit communication. They're interested. They're open. They like hearing like the message circles if they get a message. We had a lot of people from the community, come to our church for services, but they would not call themselves mediums or sensitives. if you're a medium, you don't necessarily have to be a spiritualist and be part of a community and with any of that. And I think with spiritualists who are mediums, there is a sense of, I guess, service, within the church and communicating. So some people may just want to be mediums on their own and not affiliated with any church whatsoever.
Like you mentioned, like your services and everything. I've been lucky enough that I've been to a lot of different denominations, services, but I've never been to a spiritualist service. So like, what would you say is like the main components of a spiritualist service? Maybe what would look similar to other religions that people have maybe be used to, or maybe what might be different?
So in the spiritualist church, we have a healing service. The first part, it can be about like 10 to 15 minutes of quiet music and meditation while people can go visit the healers, who will usually do like a brief healing session on them as they sit upright in a chair or on a stool or a bench. The healers can be laying their hands on them, or can be not laying their hands on them if they're doing Reiki or whatever healing modality the healer does. So that's about 10 to 15 minutes, and it just helps the congregation kind of get settled, get them in the mindset of, maybe listening to spirit, just being receptive to the sermon, and just kind of getting grounded. Then there's a sermon, which the pastors do, and usually it's non-denominational. It's usually not Christian leaning, but there are a couple of spiritualist churches that I've been to who have been a bit more Christian leaning. So it kind of depends on where you go. So usually the sermon may be like 20, 30 minutes maybe. Followed that, there's a message circle. So this is involving the entire congregation. So the pastors and any church community members are invited to give any spirit messages that they may receive. If you're approached during this time, the person will ask permission to come to you with a message. They just don't blurt out the message. There's always kind of protocol of that. If you have a message for someone, you approach them and ask them first if they are willing to receive the message. If you're receiving a message, you can choose to accept the message, or you can decline it if you don't want to receive it, or maybe you don't want to, hear it at that time. You may want to just receive it in private. That's totally okay. And at my last church, we were very big proponents of, no is a full sentence. So if you are not comfortable with anything in the message circle, you don't have to receive it. Don't feel pressured to, take part of it. And if you don't want to, you're not obligated to take part in the message circle in any form. So that's usually maybe like 20, 25 minutes, depending on how many people are participating, what spirits are coming through, if it's maybe a more general message, or if maybe it's a more personal message for a specific person. Then usually after the message circle, there's usually like a closeout prayer and like a song together, and just closing of spirit communication and, thanking the spirits and thanking everyone for coming together. And the services are a lot longer compared to like a typical church service, since there's so many components at it. And I always would kind of forget this when I go to church. I'm like, I kind of forget they last a while. They can be about 2 hours long. So it's not just one of those services where you go and you're there for 45 minutes and
on your way.
Yeah. And everyone's on their way. So sometimes when we'd have a church service, that was kind of your morning, because it was so long. But it was a really good way to kind of build community and get to know people and make it a really safe space. So that was kind of nice.
So thank you for explaining that, because again, I had a hard time initially, I think, like imagining what that would look like. But honestly, like the components, like you said, there's a lot kind of going on, but given, like we said, like where the communication is kind of coming from, where the truth is coming from, it seems natural to kind of incorporate a lot of those elements that you're talking about. And you're right, it's probably different, like community to community and, church to church a little bit here. One of the interesting things that you brought up was the healing circles and the healing practices and everything. That's something that I've been fascinated with, especially I'd say in the last few years, specifically with Reiki, and how that and some of the other, because again, I'm very ignorant to all this stuff. So if I say anything that's completely wrong, please correct me. But like Reiki seems to be gaining popularity amongst a wider audience that maybe what it had even 10, 20 years ago. As an example, I was going in for just a routine checkup, and one of the questions on a questionnaire was, have you recently had Reiki? And this is at like a major,
oh, that's interesting.
The fact that they're even like acknowledging it as like a thing. It was right there. It was kind of listed right along with acupuncture and chiropractic. I just kind of learned from someone recently, up until just a few decades ago, chiropractors were looked at very similar to Reiki practitioners and people who do acupuncture and those kind of things. They were in that same category for a long time. Then it just slowly became more accepted. At the same time, I don't know what Reiki even like means. I just know it's energy work. So how does that work with spiritualism? Because isn't it kind of like an Eastern thing, or is it not?
So I'm glad you asked,
Okay.
because I am a Reiki master.
Oh, this is perfect person to ask that. There we go.
Yeah, good segue.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I am a Reiki master. It is a Japanese healing modality, and it's gained more popularity since like the 70s and 80s. And when you were talking about having the questionnaire asking if you've had Reiki, a couple of our local hospitals, they're now offering Reiki as services like while you're in the hospital. So if you're a Reiki practitioner, you can volunteer and go give people Reiki. And yeah.
Oh, that's so cool.
which I think is so cool, because it's still something that's a little stigmatized, but it's opening up.
Right.
I'm still careful about who I mention I do Reiki to, because people still think you're wearing a tinfoil hat.
Again, like people like myself, like I like to think that I'm gleefully ignorant. Like I'm trying to learn, but there's a lot of other people out there who just don't know. And going to the chiropractor is something that everyone does nowadays. But 50 years ago, 70 years ago, it was looked at as quackery. Now it's completely accepted. Everyone's like, well, of course, like if your neck hurts, go to the chiropractor. It makes me wonder if things like Reiki aren't on that same path, just the time is a little different. If spiritualism is defined as like receiving truth from the other side, and Reiki is working with energy, how do those things mix, and how do they complement each other, or are there places where they are a little bit different or at odds?
It does complement each other. I got my Reiki 3 attunement as a Reiki practitioner through my spiritualist church. So the pastors, they're Reiki master teachers.
Interesting.
They taught all levels. And it's really cool because I think Reiki is a really accessible healing modality. And we kind of stress that, as spiritualists, we get messages from spirit, and we're just the conduit, in which the messages come through. And in Reiki, we kind of stress the same thing, where we're getting energy from source, whatever higher beings are helping us. And we are just the conduit who is helping to heal another person. And sometimes there's even a bit of disagreement on whether we even should call ourselves healers.
Right.
Since sometimes there's talk about, hey, we're not the ones doing the healing. We're just kind of helping to push that healing energy forward and make it happen.
Like the more you talk about spiritualism, and even Reiki as it kind of exists in the spiritualist kind of methodologies, there's more and more that sounds like other Eastern and Western religions that I'm more familiar with. Because like when we talk about quote unquote healers or miracles or even saints in like the Abrahamic traditions, that's one thing a lot of say is like, they're like, it's not us doing these things, this is all God, this is all God's power. We're not, like, we're just, like you said, a conduit. And I think you're right that people can get caught up in the kind of the language used, because that does carry some possible, like, ego driven weight to that, calling yourself like, oh, I'm a quote unquote healer. Because as a nerd, when I think a healer, I think of like a healer from Dungeons and Dragons or from WoW. And I'm like, no, a healer is someone who's using divine energy to raise the dead, to, heal these grievous wounds, but it's still their power. So like the words do matter, I think. And I think conduit is a very interesting word to use. Is that something that you guys use pretty regularly, or is that more of your term?
Not really. I guess it's more of like my term, because I'm thinking like, okay, we're like maybe the conduit or like the vessel for
Right.
this energy, because I feel like we don't really focus so much on the terminology, like what we call ourselves. I guess we try to keep as much ego out of it as possible.
Right.
And obviously, you know, your mileage may vary, you know, with different people.
Totally. Now,
You know, and that can get divisive, but we do try to
sure.
keep ego out of it.
Now, with the ego, that's kind of something that, going back to like the mediumship and everything, I imagine that's also something that, and maybe this is me projecting my misunderstandings, but I would think that ego would be something that would not be terribly consistent with being a spiritualist, or maybe an ethical medium, or that might be a bit of a red flag if someone is like, oh, me with these kind of things. Is that kind of the case?
Yes. It's very off-putting when someone who is a medium, even if they're a really talented medium, it is still off-putting if there's a lot of ego involved, and it's not really done from, you know, a real ethical or.
Like, again, I'm really sticking with your model of the conduit, because I think that's a very like measured way of looking at it, where you're like, because we don't know the mechanics, like the real world mechanics of a lot of these things yet, right? Like, now granted, like I think with something like the Reiki stuff, I think we will figure that out eventually, and even with the medium stuff, I think maybe there are ways to figure it out eventually, but we're not there yet when it comes to scientific studies. And so as a result, there is a level of faith that's needed.
Yes.
And anybody who compels faith through, it's a very fine line for me. But if someone who has a lot of ego and everything is telling you that like they're great, and they are great, it just doesn't seem to ever end well. It's always like, oh, this looks good right now, but if you look at it on a long enough scale, those things never seem to last. You know?
No, because usually even if someone's a very talented healer or medium, if they're the ones who are kind of more ego driven or coming from a place where they're looking to be in power or in control, it doesn't end well.
Like again, the more we talk, the more I'm like, I know spiritualism is much more like other religions than not, because you get that same thing. You get these people that come in that maybe being able to like evangelize for your religion is important to religions to keep going and keep growing, but it has to come from the right place. I think it has to come from a way of conveying truths to new people rather than sophistry. So when it comes to like what you guys do for the community, like when you say community, for the church and everything, I mean, I think that's a pretty universal way that people talk about like their churches, because it's a smaller community inside a bigger community and everything. What kind of people like do you see? Because like you said, some people are mediums, some people aren't mediums. What kind of people do you see coming to these spiritualist communities, I guess, these groups?
All sorts. Because honestly, I feel like there's an aspect of spiritualism that a lot of different people are drawn to. Some people are looking to reconnect with loved ones, you know, so they might come from, you know, maybe like a place of grief, or maybe just a place of
interesting. Okay. Yeah.
You know, interest, wanting to kind of do that research. So there are some people who have, you know, come to our church, and they may stay for a long time, you know, because they're looking to reconnect with a departed loved one, you know, and they might be hurting. So we do kind of have that subset of people, you know, so we try to be extra careful and like empathetic with them. And sometimes we understand, hey, they're not going to stay for a long time, which is fine because that's their journey, you know, but we do have, you know, people who have come to church who they say they are not mediums. They do not experience any paranormal things at home. You know, they're just kind of interested, or they're friends with someone who brought them to church and then they just stayed. And I've known some people who've gone to either our spiritualist church or one of the spiritualist churches in the city. You know, they're well off and they're pretty cultured and they have really good jobs. So it really kind of depends, you know, because also in our church, we've had people kind of from more rural backwoods, you know, like coming out of the woodwork to church. So it's very, It's very varied.
Mm-hmm. Like truth is truth. So like if that's the case, then it should appeal to all people, kind of thing.
Right. I mean, because
So
if
like
you
I
would
think
come
that's a
into our
good
church,
sign.
you're not going to be, walking into a room with a bunch of weirdos wearing tinfoil hats, and we don't look that weird.
Exactly. We're still weird, but not that weird. Yeah.
We're still weird, but not that weird.
No, but it's I think that's good though, because I think that like, and this kind of leads into something we kind of wanted to talk about later, but I think that it's appropriate given like the talking about the communities. Like when I would have originally thought about a spiritualist church, I would have immediately thought of the stereotypical medium that we're used to seeing on television, movies, all the, TV shows and everything. I imagine them all coming from the place Lilydale that we're going to talk about at some point here. Doesn't sound like that's the case. I think
Right.
That's a really good thing.
And even in some aspects, people can be spiritualists, but also identify with another main religion. We
Right.
have like people who are Catholics who have come in, or people who identify as pagans who come in. So it's kind of one of those neutral places where you can like come be in the church, but that doesn't necessarily have to be your main focus as far as your religion.
Again, what you're saying with spirit communication, I mean, really, that really kind of exists in a lot of other religions too. I mean, we have like obviously anyone that believes in an afterlife and believes that there are ways to communicate with the afterlife, that's a lot of them. I mean, definitely the Abrahamic religions, that there's definitely quite a few Eastern religions that have that, with anyone that even has ancestor worship, because like the truth is just coming from this other like location, for lack of a better term, that doesn't seem to be directly counter to any other of like the major religions.
People don't realize that spiritualism does complement a lot of other religions. And I've used this for an example before, but very talented medium here in Rochester, she had once mentioned that growing up Catholic, they were not allowed to talk about spirits. So she was like, yeah, I was a medium, but since we were Catholic, I couldn't talk about it. But I grew up Catholic, and all we talked about was spirits. So to me, my experience was, growing up Catholic, that's why we were allowed to talk about spirits. And then I go to a friend's Methodist church and they're all weirded out,
Right. I think talking about spirits is probably more of a personal thing that gets attributed to whatever religion someone has versus the other way around. I can imagine growing up a medium, or just having those skills, or whatever that path is for those folks. I imagine it's easier to have some sort of a structure or framework to at least start with. Would you say that's the case? Like, we don't need to get into like everyone's journey or anything right off the bat.
Yeah,
but
no, I think it does make it easier if you're a kid and you're seeing spirits or getting some kind of spirit communications. I think it does help if your parents, can kind of validate that and be like, no, you're okay.
Right. No kid wants to feel weird or feel like they're, you want to run that line between feeling special, but also fitting in kind of thing. Like, you want to be both. No one wants to feel like they're ostracized. So I imagine just even having the words for it, or having a family that could be like, oh no, that's a thing.
It was more normalized in my family. And I didn't realize until years later that my British great grandmother on my dad's side, she was a spiritualist in England.
Really?
And, yes. And my dad
never
mentioned that until maybe, I don't know, 2009 or so. It was like, hey,
that seems
like, did you know that she was a spiritualist? I said, no, you never thought to tell me this?
That's wild. Oh my
God. So I always thought that was a cool connection. So just kind of in the family, I guess it stayed even unintentionally.
Like, certain people are going to have certain propensities at the very least, given where they've come from and who they come from. I don't listen. I'm not necessarily a big proponent of like, oh, everyone has this very set, rigid path of things that are going to happen, but it seems like those things happen more often than not, and they feel very natural. Now, speaking of the history, something that we mentioned briefly earlier, and I know I wanted to touch on because it's something that I had some mixed feelings on, and was one of my few, I guess, like real world interactions with mediums. And that was the aforementioned Lilydale. the reason I wanted to ask you about it was because, one, because I just know very little about it. But two, like I have had family members and friends that have gone there, and for the most part, a lot of them have had really good experiences, which again, honestly, wasn't what I would have initially expected. Because I think I was definitely someone who, whenever money gets involved, it just starts to really weird me out, and always has.
Yes.
For those of our listeners who aren't familiar with Lily Dale, can you give us a little bit of just a brief kind of like 10,000 foot view of it?
So Lily Dale, it's in New York State. It's here in New York. It is the main spiritualist community for the spiritualist religion. And that's kind of where like the headquarters are. It's its own little village. Like people live there and they operate. Every year they get like tourists who come, and you can visit like the museum, and there's a library and a healing temple, and a bunch of mediums live there in the little colorful cottages, and you can get like readings, and there's also communal message circles that go on. So it's really busy during the summer. So it's one of those where kind of as a spiritualist, you want to get there, at least once in your lifetime. And I've been there with, other medium friends. And I kind of have a love-hate with Lily Dale, but.
Well, let me maybe set you up like this. I was under the impression that Lily Dale was like the major leagues for mediums. Like to be there was some sort of again, this is me being ignorant. I assume there was some sort of like, vetting process through something. I assume something happened somewhere and it was like, these are the best of the best kind of thing. Turns out like that's not necessarily, I'm not correct in that statement.
So a lot of the mediums who are there, from what I understand, just as a spiritualist, so they do have to be vetted by the Lily Dale Assembly. So they do have to go through a, rigorous enough process of, getting into the community and, kind of proving themselves, having training. A lot of them have like certifications. And it is kind of one of those places where if you are a medium who lives in Lily Dale, from my understanding, you can live there in the houses. You can buy the house, but it's through a leasehold. So you do not own the land. And from what I understand, Lily Dale, as a community, they don't do mortgages. So a lot of the mediums who live there, whether just full-time or part-time, they have to have another method of being able to afford the house. So sometimes you'll see ads for houses for Lily Dale, and they'll disclose that, hey, it's cash only. And, you have to sign a leasehold. So there is kind of that aspect where I think some people go into it thinking that the Lily Dale mediums are the cream of the crop. And I'm sure there's some amazing ones. I'm sure there's amazing ones, but it's not the end all be all.
The folks that I know have gone there have overwhelmingly had positive experiences. But I do think it's important for people to understand like that structure, like you just said. Context is important whenever you're deciding who to trust with your emotional, physical, and financial matters.
I think that is important because even like when I first went to Lily Dale, I kind of taken that into consideration, but I also went there thinking like, this is like the spiritualist mecca of the world. So I was kind of expecting this really lovely spiritual, heartfelt moment that I guess didn't really happen for me, just in the sense that it was more business minded, more touristy, which I can also appreciate that it has to be touristy to some extent, because I mean, that's a lot of the revenue. So that's kind of the catch-22. So I think maybe just my advice is, if you go, it can be a really cool place, just manage your expectations.
That's good advice almost anywhere.
Yes.
I would say. Now, two things that kind of branch off that I kind of wanted to go into. It's hard to talk about spiritualism. Like we've been talking now for over half an hour. We've yet to mention the Fox sisters. And just in like our brief conversation that me and you had, initially, I learned more about the Fox sisters from that conversation than I had in all the times we've actually researched them, where I've actively been trying to find stuff out. Do you mind giving a brief overview of like the just like who the Fox sisters were, and then maybe we can get into some of the misconceptions might be?
Yeah. So this is a very loaded question. It can be its
Yes.
own
Right.
podcast in itself. So pop some popcorn. I'll try to keep it brief. So the Fox sisters, they are credited with being the founders of modern American Day spiritualism. In 1848, March 31st, 1848, that's when Kate and Maggie Fox, they were living in their house in Hydesville, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And they were pretty new to the house. The Fox family, they had moved into the house just as a rental so they could build their own house, from what my understanding is.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty soon after moving into the house, they were hearing like raps and knockings, and it was keeping the family up. They were kind of weirded out. And they ended up, the two girls, Kate and Maggie, who were about like, I think 11 or 13 at the time, they started thinking, well, maybe this is a ghost. So they started doing some spirit communications with it, because it would be, knocking or rapping on the walls.
Mm-hmm.
So they were asking the spirit, saying, hey, do as I do. And they would knock, and they'd get like the knocking sounds back. So this is something that went on for days and weeks. The neighbors caught on. They were kind of inviting the neighbors over to see like, hey, what do you make of this? So that kind of grew from that. They were the youngest daughters of Mr. and Mrs. Fox, who had grown children who already like married out of the house. So one of the girls went to stay with their brother David, while the other sister went to go stay with their older married sister Leah up in Rochester, because they thought, hey, maybe if we separate these girls, it'll stop this knocking and all this racket. But it didn't. So each girl was still having the spirit communications. Still having the issues at their respective houses where they stayed. So that was kind of where it started. And when they were communicating with this alleged spirit in their house in Hydesville, they were able to communicate with him and found out that allegedly it was a male. It was a man who was a peddler, and he said that he was murdered in the house. So at the time, the neighbors were like, hey, well, maybe like we'll dig up in the basement, because he said he was like buried in the basement. And when the neighbors tried to dig, like the basement flooded, so they couldn't really get that far. And Mr. Fox was like, no, let's not do this. So
can you not dig up my basement? That sounds
can you not dig up my basement? So that was always kind of the story. And later down the road, a woman came forward. Her name was Lucretia Pulver. She used to be a hired hand for a family who used to live in that house. So Lucretia Pulver, she lived with Mr. and Mrs. Bell. They were a couple. They did not have children living with them. She would live with them during the school week, because the schoolhouse was closer to their house than her house in Newark. And then on the weekend, she would go back to her family's farm. So Lucretia Pulver, she had later came forward saying, hey, when the Bells lived in this house, a really weird thing happened. She said a peddler came and stayed with them, like in his travels. And she had ordered some stuff from the peddler, but said, hey, since I don't have money with me, when I go home on the weekend to my father's farm, can you deliver these goods to the farm, and then we'll pay you then.
Probably a normal thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So when she went home for the weekend, the peddler never showed up, and she got notice from Mrs. Bell that she was no longer needed at the house to come help with the house or stay there, which she thought was weird. Later on, she was allowed to come back to the house. So she went back to stay with the Bells, kept going to school. So Lucretia Pulver, she had noticed that the peddler never came to her father's house to deliver the goods. The Bells couldn't really seem to account for the peddler, but she noticed that they had more possessions in their house than they did the last time she was there. So she thought, well, they ordered a lot of stuff from the peddler, they must have just bought a lot of things. That was something that Lucretia Pulver came forward with. And she had mentioned that the Bells had moved shortly after. Now, another family moved into the house, and they only stayed for, I think, like 3 or 4 months. because they said they thought the place was haunted. They were hearing knocks and raps, and they were creeped out. So they did not stay. The Fox sisters, this was not a story that they knew at the time.
How long after the Fox sisters' notoriety was Lucretia's story coming out?
I'm actually not sure. I'm not sure what year that was. I do know she has like a published account. So that was always kind of the story of like Lucretia Pulver, kind of validating, yeah, there was a peddler, and it was weird that he never came to the farm to deliver the goods. We never heard from him again. She put that out there, just thought it was weird.
So that story kind of validates the fact that they were communicating with what we're calling a legitimate entity at that point. Like that story kind of matches up. That's knowledge they couldn't have had. Yeah.
Right. So that was some validation. And just to fast forward past some of the Fox sisters, we can get back to them. In the very early 1900s, at this point, the Fox property, like the house, was not in good condition. Like no one lived there. And some boys were just playing at the house, playing in the basement. And I guess they were roughhousing, and they found the false wall in the basement that I guess no one knew was a false wall, where they found human remains and the peddler's case.
That sounds like that. Like that sounds crazy. Like I would have lost. What year would that have been? You think? Like
I think it was 1906.
So like early 1900s.
Very, very early 1900s. So and the peddler's case is now at the Lilydale Museum.
That's literally was going to be my next question. Yes. Like, do we have that case?
Yes. So allegedly the case is at the Lilydale Museum.
That's interesting.
I've seen it. It's cool. If that is the truth of like how that was found and what happened, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
If it's some crappy hoax, well, I've been mad, but
right.
But if that's the truth, that is really cool. So that was kind of like the validation that spiritualism kind of got like way later after,
and dead. Yeah, and it's interesting because like a lot of my early understanding of the Fox sisters was my understanding after reading a lot of that stuff had always been, it seemed like the Fox sisters had a lot of legitimate activity going on early on in life with like I didn't know about this peddler's case or anything. I'd never heard that before. It's a wild story, but it makes me understand why some of the not contemporary, but writings from that are historic, but not contemporary to the Fox sisters were like, no, yeah, it seems like there was some weird stuff going on and they seem to legitimately be communicating with folks. And then you have all the stuff that came out about the like double jointed toes and like ankles cracking and stuff like that. And that's where a lot of like the the Fox sisters are a hoax became the main narrative. Outside of like the one main article, the article that I'm speaking of is the one written by the oldest, well, not written by, but interviewing the oldest, was it the oldest sister?
So the older of the three sisters was Leah, who ended up, she was the older one who lived in Rochester, and she acted as their manager.
Okay, yes, that's the one I'm thinking of.
I have a lot of feelings about her.
Well, but she's the one who basically had that interview that basically said, "Oh yeah, like we made it all up." Was that her or was that someone else?
That wasn't Leah.
But it seems like from what you've told me, some of the circumstances around them specifically being hoaxes or hoaxing or whatever might not have been gathered in the most ethical manner.
Right. So there's always kind of the question, like, were the Fox sisters 100% on board? Was this always spirit communication? Because a lot of people did say like, hey, maybe that was them like cracking their toes or like, like cracking their fingers. When they were doing like performances at like sold out theaters, there were people who held on to, like their wrists and their feet to make sure that they didn't like crack their knuckles or like crack their joints. And when they made their debut at Corinthian Hall here in Rochester, they got wildly popular. That was something people were interested in. But it did kind of devolve into, hey, to try to debunk this, let's monitor the girls. So there was a point where, it kind of evolved or devolved, if you will, from just like holding their ankles and, kind of checking them to the girls basically being stripped naked before a before a performance, like in a theater, to make sure
And
that
how-
they didn't have anything under their clothes.
Yeah, and just for the record, how old
Yeah.
were they at this time?
So when the events started at
Yeah.
their house, they were about 11 and 13.
Yeah,
So
so they were
by the time that
teenagers.
so they were like early
Ugh.
teenagers and mid-teenagers by the time they were, kind of like touring around, and Leah was bringing them to New York City,
Yeah.
which is eventually where they moved because they had so
Yeah.
much going on down there.
That's so wild.
And then there were complaints that all these male doctors were examining them, so they had women also in the room.
Mhm.
So I do feel like that is a very unethical and traumatic thing that they must have gone through.
Right. Right.
So I do feel some sympathy with that.
That kind of establishes that people were going to great lengths to try and debunk them early on.
Oh yeah, and like Harry Houdini hated them,
Mhm.
so they had a
Right.
lot of they had like enemies in that sense, people trying to debunk what they were doing. And in a sense, kind of as they got older, from my understanding, their interest kind of went to other things. Like they were in New York City. One of the sisters, she wanted to get married. She met Elijah Kane. He was an Arctic explorer.
Which is super cool in its own right,
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, he has his own story.
Right, right.
So there were things that they wanted to do, and eventually got married, had kids. And and they went to England, and they stayed in England. So they did tour for a long time, but I feel like that was something that also kind of pushed them into alcoholism, because they were known alcoholics.
Right.
So that was troubling. So by the time they both died, I mean, they were not old. I think they were in their 50s.
Yeah.
And they were not in good health. They were very poor. One of the sisters died in her friend's boarding house, and the friend had to pay for the funeral costs because there just wasn't anything.
Yeah.
In her name. No.
Whenever people are talking about hoaxing, it's always like, well, like, for what purpose and to what end? If they were doing all this and hoaxing all this, it didn't work out.
Right.
And so it doesn't, I mean, that's something that's kind of always kind of bothered me. And again, alcoholism is one of those things where that stuff any of those kind of addictions will make otherwise very ethical people do some very strange things. It's certainly a lot more complicated than what I had initially thought of. Would I be correct in saying that it's not like spiritualism owes probably a certain debt to the Fox sisters from a popularity standpoint, but would I be correct in saying that it's not like everyone hangs their hat of legitimacy on the Fox sisters?
Correct. I mean, because
Right.
I think with, you wouldn't have American spiritualism as we know it, without the Fox sisters and kind of giving credit to them. But talking to spirits is not a new thing. I mean,
Right.
Obviously,
Yeah.
Certain religions and even certain movements in America. And, the Shakers were very into spirit communication, so it's kind of validating for them when the Fox sisters kind of gained in popularity. The Quakers, they were supporters of the Fox sisters. So I think there is kind of a certain, aspect to look at with that. Like Isaac and Amy Post, they were liberal Quakers here in Rochester. They were leaders in abolition and women's rights movements,
Right.
and they were supporters of the Fox sisters. That was something that resonated with them. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not surprised, because I mean, every time I learn something new about the Society of Friends, I'm always pleasantly surprised with how progressive they always seem to be.
Yes.
With again, relatively speaking, where they were coming from in the times and everything. But whenever I hear oh yeah, the Quakers were cool with these people, it's always oh, okay, makes sense. That sounds about right.
They're oh yeah, we're good.
Yeah. We really need to do a specific episode on some of the lore around them at some point. There's so much of it that looks like this old fire and brimstone puritanical nightmare stuff, but what they're saying a lot of times, or what the meaning behind a lot of it is very borders on Eastern. It's
so
with how
the Shakers were very progressive with spirit communication. They gave messages in there, and their services.
Right.
And that was before the Fox sisters came along.
For sure.
So they would give messages, and they have specific Shaker songs that they feel like that was channeled from spirit. And there's a lot of Shaker art that they feel is spirit art.
And again, the more I learn about stuff like this and spiritualism, the more it's like nothing is new.
Right. That's why like we can appreciate the Fox sisters, but what they were doing was not new.
Right.
And that's why it's like we can thank them, but we don't necessarily have to look up to them as the main focal points.
Well, and that's something that I feel like I'm glad to have you as a spiritualist and medium say that out loud, because I feel like for the longest time I assumed that was the case, much like how UFO folks view Roswell and how Bigfoot folks viewed the Patterson Gimlin film. And when really it seems like that bar has more been imposed on spiritualism by lay folk rather than you guys saying like, oh yeah, the Fox sisters are the best thing ever. You know, like
if you look up the Fox sisters online, you see more articles from non-believers, just saying it was a hoax, and they don't have a ton of information.
Right. They don't.
If it's good information, I'll take it. But a lot of what I found was not amazingly well informed.
Well, thank you for saying that, because it makes me feel a whole lot better about my previous research. Like, again, the context, a lot of the articles speaks about it as past tense.
Oh, yes. They call it like the 19th century movement that died and it's a hoax.
Right.
And everything's fake and it's hilarious and Houdini was out to get them. So they make it kind of sensational. They don't realize we're still around.
Yeah. You guys like, hey, we're still here, buddy.
We're still here.
Again, that's kind of really why I wanted to have this conversation, was because like it being a living, breathing current movement is just something I just didn't know about. And obviously that means how I speak about it, the things that I pull from it, or the things I critique about it are going to be contextualized differently. Kind of the last like big thing I want to touch on while we have this conversation today is, since we did talk about Bigfoot and UFOs and everything, is there is a obvious, at least to me, there is an obvious like overlap between mediumship and a lot of the modern, what I'll call the modern paranormal movement, when it comes to and how I'm going to define that. And I know I'm going to get emails about this, so please, the Ghost Furnace Podcast at gmail.com, everybody. I'm going to say that like the modern paranormal investigation movement is based off of the idea that through utilizing both subjective and objective methods and instrumentation, we can gain knowledge about a body of phenomena that we're trying to kind of compartmentalize. In mediumship, the idea of speaking to spirits seems like it has been intertwined with that from the beginning. As long as you've had people looking into spirits, it seems like from an investigative standpoint, they've been like, oh, well, here's our medium. Now, granted, I don't know if that's true, because I'm just going off of like what I have seen in my research and movies. So first off, is that even a true statement that I'm making?
I feel like there's more paranormal investigation groups that are not mediums, or they don't have kind of the resident medium with them, rather than paranormal groups that do.
Really interesting. Okay.
Yeah, just from my experience, dealing with like other groups and like meeting people, I haven't had the experience of meeting a lot of paranormal groups who do use mediums. Sometimes people say like they're sensitive and like that's really cool. Yeah. So they'll utilize them. But sometimes I guess one of the things that kind of separates my paranormal investigation group is that a bunch of us are mediums. So our investigations look a whole lot different. Like we go into a place to investigate, and, like the homeowner or the business owner, they're, they want to tell us all about it. We're like, no, we're like, do not tell us anything. We want to come in here cold. They're like, don't you want to know it? No, we don't. Don't tell us. So sometimes like the,
Mm-hmm.
homeowner or business owner, they don't necessarily know what to do with us. We're like, no, you just do you. Like,
Yeah.
just hang out. Like, don't tell any stories.
Yeah.
Tell your sister who's coming with you not to say anything. So we do come through that, very
Mm-hmm.
differently.
Your group specifically, no, is it mainly mediums or all mediums?
No, it's just a mix.
It is a mix. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So so I used to run a mediums league out
Mm-hmm.
of my old spiritualist church, and a bunch of us, if we still, get together and investigate, but we
Yeah.
also have other people, in the group who aren't
Mm-hmm.
mediums.
Right.
So it's a nice mix, and we still like having our equipment, and we like
Mm-hmm.
debunking things and kind of taking things from like more measured approach.
Right.
So we're not taking pictures and
Mm-hmm.
saying like, oh, these are orbs and it's just dust.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I've always said that I think that if you're doing any investigation, like it does take a spectrum. It's not going to be just
Yes.
one thing or one approach. You need to have a bunch of different things. So when it comes to what you guys do in your group, whenever you guys do, whether it's a investigation or whether it's people kind of coming to you individually, do you guys look at that as doing work as far as like trying to help and heal people and spirits, or is it more of an investigation as in like are you trying to fix what's in front of you or searching things out, I guess? Because to me those are different approaches.
It's both depending on what the homeowner or the
Okay.
business owner wants.
Interesting. Okay.
Because sometimes like, we have, gone to someone's house where they're like, hey, we think something's going on. Can you figure out what it is? And can you please get rid of it?
Mm-hmm.
So we've done that. Other times we've been to, people's houses or a business where they just want to know what's going on. They don't necessarily
Right.
feel threatened, but before we do any investigation, we'll, kind of put up our psychic shields. We'll protect
Right.
ourselves. We'll like, maybe like sage
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. We kind of make sure to protect ourselves since no one
Mm-hmm.
needs to follow us home.
Right.
So I kind of feel like maybe some of like our protocols are different, and
Mm-hmm.
we approach, kind of like the spirits and communicating with them kind of from a more human approach. We're not really there to just get cool EVPs and leave.
Right. Which is fine. Like there's people who that's what they do, and it's like that's cool. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I like the fact that you guys are tailoring what you're trying to do based off of the needs of others rather than your own, I guess, because that seems more in line with everything you're saying about the spiritualist religion. Seems to be about using this information to help and heal. There's less ego in it, even whenever you go out from it. And that seems to be one of the consistencies that I think is really interesting. Because again, like when I think of like a medium going on a paranormal investigation, I think of the little old lady from Poltergeist. That's the first thing that comes into my head. Now granted, like that lady says something, I'm going to listen, like but so would you say that like kind of what you guys learn as a community in a church, both, I mean, I understand you can't speak for every spiritualist, but like for yourself, like, do you find like you find yourself learning things in maybe both of those realms or both of those settings that end up informing the other?
Yes. I mean, I feel like I'll forever be a student. I'll be an expert on nothing. And I feel like, the more, I'm involved with spirit or, investigating a house with my group or something, we're always learning like different things and different ways to communicate, and maybe different things that are in the house that isn't just a spirit, so we kind of see different things. And I just find that fascinating. And I kind of feel like that's like a little flame in my heart that's never really going to go out.
Right.
Because it's just so cool. But I love being in a position where, if people are kind of scared in their own home and they need help and they come to us for help, it is nice that we can help them.
No, that's
so it's not just like, showing them some evidence and then leaving. No, we'll get some evidence. We'll show you what we got. We'll tell you what we've been all picking up on. But we'll also do like a house cleansing. We'll cross people over, we'll cross over spirits. And we always like involve the homeowners in that to give them, some kind of like control over the situation and some kind of autonomy. So a lot of the times we'll open up a circle and, cross over spirits in the house that, need to, cross over. We always kind of open that option up.
That's awesome. So when it comes to like, God, it's wild. So because honestly, like I do think we need to have you back on for an entire episode about like your ghost hunting stuff and
I
everything.
could go on, man.
I know we could this could be a very, very long episode. I especially want Nick and Mike to be available for that. But while I still have you here to kind of like wrap, kind of bookend what we've been talking about today, when it comes to spiritualism as a whole, like you said, how it kind of got its roots in other major religions and then kind of like became its own identifiable entity, no pun intended, that's kind of like evolved since then. Well, I guess my question is, has in the last, let's say, 100 years or, since the bulk of the spiritualist movement, we'll say, has spiritualism as a religion changed much in that period of time? And maybe how so or how not? Depending.
Well, I would say it's probably changed a lot, just in the sense where I think when spiritualism was gaining popularity, I mean, you had a lot of fake mediums, you had a lot of, charlatans just trying to like, charge people for the money. And they were, preying on, widows, and especially like during and after the Civil War.
Right.
I kind of feel like there was that era of, kind of having to ride out a lot of fake people in the movement. That being said, I think that there's probably not some super ethical people, still today. But I think the movement, it's definitely gotten smaller, but I think it's probably gotten more nuanced, probably stronger in its own right. And I think it's gotten where you're not just focusing on the Fox sisters, and kind of that section of like, oh, we're having a seance. It's evolved beyond just having a seance and, looking to the Fox sisters for kind of what they're doing. You'll see a lot of people in spiritualism, who like they're open to Reiki, they're open to other healing modalities, and a bunch of New Agers too.
Yeah, right.
Do with them what you will, but but I think it's kind of more varied a religion than maybe people give it credit for. I think people are way more open to accepting different people into the fold. Because like I said, I mean, you can have your main religion or belief system and still be a spiritualist, or still come to the spiritualist church. You don't have to just identify as that. So there's like no pressure, to conform in that aspect.
Generally speaking, you would say that like the religion has maybe grown in its acceptance of other practices, while still kind of holding on to kind of principles that it's kind of taken from the beginning. Like nothing has really changed with the idea that like there is a life after death and we can gain knowledge from them.
Yeah, so that's still the core value, but I think, as years have gone on, we've kind of dropped maybe some of maybe the criticism or like the disbelievers was, I mean, we're not like super popular.
Right. Well,
not as popular as it was during the, 1800s. So I think there's an aspect of, since it is a little smaller, you can kind of conform that into something a bit more nuanced,
a little
empathetic.
more flexible.
Yes, yeah.
Would you say that the religion is growing in popularity, or is it still shrinking, or is it holding about steady? Do you think the last, generation or so?
It's really hard to say, because I feel like I've seen spiritualist churches close. I've seen them go through a lot of growth. I've seen them go through a lot of discord. And I think that can also go back to churches will struggle if a lot of ego and power hungry people get involved. And I think maybe the spiritualist churches can be a bit more susceptible to that, just since they are newer and they're not necessarily worshiping any one thing. There's not necessarily one entity holding us all together. All spiritualist churches can look really different. When I lived in California, my spiritualist church there looked a little different than what I've seen here in New York, but I have seen the churches grow in their own ways, but I've also seen some churches close. So that's a really good question.
Right.
It's just really hard for me to answer that.
Well, yeah, and again, I obviously don't need you to speak to all spiritualists and everything and all mediums. Is there like a main governing body for spiritualism that like can be the flag bearer for like advertising and trying to get people on board, or is it a bunch of little more congregations?
So there's the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, which is like the main organizational entity for spiritualist churches here in America. And then there's the Spiritualists National Union, which is based in the UK for UK churches.
Okay.
But not every spiritualist church here in America is affiliated with either of those. The spiritualist churches that I've been a part of, they weren't affiliated with either.
Really?
Although there is a local spiritualist church that is affiliated with the Spiritualist National Union, which is from the UK.
The UK.
It's kind of, yeah. So I don't know how that happened, but their governing body is based in the UK, even though they're in New York. Yeah. So those are those two main organizations. So not all spiritualist churches are affiliated with those, and churches who are affiliated with those organizations tend to have like stricter rules, more protocol. So that's just something to consider.
Interesting.
If you go to any of them.
So if someone walks into one of those churches that is affiliated, they're likely to maybe see a little more, probably a lot of the same elements that you mentioned with your churches, but maybe the structure might be a little different.
I think the structure would be the same, but I think what they wouldn't realize is just maybe some, unspoken rules that they wouldn't.
Oh, really? See. Okay.
Yeah. So for example, in our church, when we would have the message circle, anyone was welcome to get up and deliver a message if you got a message from Spirit. In the churches that are affiliated with, the National Spiritualist Association of Churches, for here in America, from what I understand, a lot of the message circles, you're not allowed, not anyone is just allowed to give a message. You have to be a medium with the church or a student medium. And I have seen where, an acquaintance of mine, he was a very talented medium. He went to a spiritualist church in the city who was associated with the National Association. And even though he was a very gifted medium, long-term medium, he still had to prove himself as a student medium in the church in order to give messages or whatnot. So I guess that's something to consider. So maybe if someone just goes into one of these churches, sits for a service, it's, they might not realize any of that.
Some of that stuff.
Some of the rules and the protocol are different.
Interesting. So you've given me a lot to think about today, as usual. But before we go, and again, this is for everyone listening, this is not the last time you're going to hear Taryn on this podcast, I think. But before you go, because this is the Ghost Furnace, I would be remiss if I didn't ask. Could you give us one good either mediumship story or ghost investigation story for us? Doesn't have to be a big one, just because I think we're going to be talking about your investigative stuff down the road, but anything spooky or anything related to the holidays maybe, or anything recent that you might want to share. And if not, I'm just for the record, I am putting her on the spot. So
how about this is a teaser?
There we go.
Episode.
Even better. I love that. Good idea.
So how about the time when some of my investigation group and I, and this was just us mediums, we went down to a horse farm in Pennsylvania because the woman who was the farm owner, her and her boarders, they were getting really scared with things they were seeing. The horses were getting sick.
Oh, really?
So it was,
wow.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. She had lost a couple horses in 2 years.
Ugh.
And she thought it was really suspicious. And I'm a horse owner myself. And another friend of mine had actually gotten this case. She's a medium in Buffalo. And she asked me, she's like, do you want this? She's like, I think this is evil. I don't want to touch it. And I was like, hell yes, I want it. So we went down there and investigated the horse farm. And I'll just say that's where I saw my first demon or non-human entity. And there were portals in the pasture and in the woods, and we closed the portals and got rid of some things. And it was just wild. And it's literally like my favorite story to talk about, and I still keep in touch with the farm owner, because this was back in like 2012, and she said like the horses got better and everything was like really good, so it's like we didn't just like go there and leave, but I kept in touch with her, and things have been really good there.
So the horses are okay. That's the important thing.
Horses are okay.
Horses are okay.
And a lot of the things that like we saw and related to the farm owner and her friends who were there, they saw the same things. So it was kind of cool to kind of get that validation. I'm
like, you guys can't see me, but like my blood pressure is going up over here because that sounds so like wild. Man, that's okay. Yeah. So see that now we have to have you back on another episode.
Yes, for next time, friends.
No, we can't leave everybody just with that hanging for too long. Oh my God. Okay. No, that's a heck of a teaser right there. That's better than anything I could have come up with. First off, thank you so much, Taryn. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today. I really hope that you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did.
I did. This was amazing. And just thank you for having me, because it was so nice to kind of just be able to talk to someone and, have a voice. Because I don't get to talk to a lot of people about spiritualism and mediumship. So this was really nice.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And again, that's going back to why I originally wanted to have this conversation, was because like, again, I think spiritualism and to an extent too, mediumship, as someone who has even researched these things, we can even be woefully miseducated. I like to practice what I preach, and whenever I find out I'm getting something wrong, I want to get it right. I want to learn more. I want to figure out what I'm missing, where the gaps are in that knowledge. And so I really appreciate you helping me understand a lot more about spiritualism and mediumship. And it's been really wonderful to hear your experience in those things, to give it context. So hopefully when people hear either us talk about spiritualism or mediumship, or they hear it on TV shows or other podcasts or read it in books, they have some new context for it that they might not have had initially.
Right. And because where else would they have found it?
Right.
So it's kind of nice to get some information out there, at least just to think about. You don't have to be an immediate believer, just think about it.
Right, exactly. And I think that's all part of like the process. Again, really excited to have you back in the future to talk about that story you just teased, because that's going to be fantastic. I think that's going to be.
We got a lot to talk about.
That's going to be a hit. But for anyone out there, if you have any thoughts, comments, concerns, stories, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach us on Instagram or Facebook at Ghost Furnace Podcast, or to send us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.